Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Strand. My name is Robin, and I help direct the events here at Strand. For a little bit of history, Strand was founded in 1927 by the Bass family over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until, after over 92 years, Strand is the sole survivor, still in the Bass family, running 400 events a year, and still housing new and used books. Tonight, I'm thrilled to have with us Chris Liddell-Westefeld, who is here to celebrate and discuss his brand new book, They Said This Day Would Never Come, Chasing the Dream on Obama's Improbable Campaign, the exciting tale of Barack Obama's first presidential campaign as told by the volunteers and staff who helped propel him to the presidency. Liddell-Westefeld joined the Obama for America campaign in 2007 and spent 5 years on the Obama White House staff. He has documented the story of Obama's presidency since 2014. Joining him in conversation is Kal Penn, actor and former associate director of the White House Office of Public Engagement. Kal was a national co-chair for President Obama's re-election campaign in 2012 and served on the President's Committee for the Arts and Humanities. Kal is known for his roles on Hulu and NBC's Sunnyside, as well as other shows, Designated Survivor, House, How I Met Your Mother, and the Harold and Kumar franchise. It's a real pleasure to have them here, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Chris Liddell-Westefeld and Kal Penn to the Strand.
Thanks, everybody. How you doing? How's your chair?
It's great.
Thank you for joining us here in the erotica section. I'm very excited that I wish that's where your book was placed, but sadly it's just the section we're in.
If only 8th grade me could see me now.
I want to dive right in. I think, obviously everybody who's here knows what the book is about. If you haven't read it yet, you hopefully will. It's a great read. I'm heavily biased in telling you that, but it really is. How did the idea for the book come about, and how did we end up here with an actual book?
Yeah, so the book, it came out of this oral history project I started in January 2014. I was working on the White House, and my job was assistant staff secretary, which basically meant I was responsible for the president's briefing book. And when you work in the White House, you see up close how a presidency is documented. Every email is archived, every photo is public record, everyone who comes in contact with the president is screened by the Secret Service ahead of time. So there's this rich archive that gets created for history of the presidency itself. But comparatively little had been done to document the campaign that put him in office. And so the thinking was I would spend a year and just go around and interview people who had been involved in the campaign and try to preserve their memories for history. When you looked back at what had been done at that point, it was mostly memoirs by the campaign leadership. There had been, books documenting the strategy of the campaign, but the vast majority of people who participated in that were volunteers or organizers, and very little had been done to document what their experience was like. And so that was kind of the origin of it. And then the book grew out of that. And so one of the things that struck me, when I went to do this, was the different ways that people had come to be involved in the campaign. And one of the reasons that Kal is in the book was because he had come out to Iowa in December 2007, I think it was.
October
2007, sorry. And spent time there as a volunteer. So one of the things I would ask people was how they came to do that. And do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, sure. The book is full of, I think, each of our stories that all sort of thematically involved the same thing, which was, in my case, in 2007, I was on a TV show called House, and there was the Writers Guild of America went on strike, so we couldn't shoot any more scripts after a certain point. And I had read Obama's book. I saw the 2004 speech at the DNC that obviously inspired a lot of people. And I thought, all right, I'll spend 3 days in Des Moines volunteering. And so I went to Des Moines for the first non-political surrogate tour. So there were 3 actors, myself, Olivia Wilde, and Megalyn Ichikanwake. And the 3 of us were the first non-political surrogate tour. And it was supposed to be 3 days of going to a bunch of college campuses to get people to sign these supporter cards that said you intended to caucus for Barack Obama. And by the 3rd day, I was totally in love with all of the volunteers that I met, the president's staffers, people who were sleeping on couches in campaign offices, working 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, because they really cared very deeply about, no Iraq war, no lobbyist money in politics. And the guy was 30 points down on the polls, and I was like, yeah, I think I need to stay here. There's no excuse for going back to LA. But that's the exact same story that I think a lot of people had, where, yeah, I'm going to do a week volunteering for Obama, and then people ended up just staying.
Yeah, and so what I had hoped to pull out of the book is, obviously there's if you follow politics, there's well-known names in the book. David Axelrod, David Plouffe, the president is in there. But the core of the story is people who were volunteers or field organizers, people who were on the ground, and trying to show what the progression of that was like, to go from him when he announced, running a distant second nationally, running 3rd in Iowa, this thing that was really unlikely, to today he is the most popular politician in the world. And he is the most successful politician of the last 50 years. And so to follow people who not only wanted him to become president, but decided to do something about it when it was really unlikely to happen, were the people I wanted to put at the core of that story.
You essentially reported on your own past, or at least that was the journey that you started, right? Wanting to document everything. What were some of the things that surprised you along the way?
Yeah, so my origin story is a strong term. The way I got involved in the Obama campaign was I was a senior at the University of Iowa, and I was really interested in politics. And after the 2004 election, I had involved in 2004, but George Bush was reelected with a majority of the vote, and I was basically despondent. I had no idea how this had happened. I couldn't understand how the country had reelected someone who had led us into a war under false pretenses after losing the popular vote. And so I started reading, desperate to do something, whatever that was. I started reading about presidential elections and realized that living in Iowa, and specifically living in Iowa City, which is the most liberal part of Iowa, I was perfectly positioned to get involved in the next election. And so all of these people who thought about running for president would come through town. And I saw, like, John Kerry came to a Hawkeye football tailgate, and there was a famous photo that went out on the AP of him being offered a beer bong and turning it down. Mark Warner, who was then governor of Virginia, came and just played basketball with a dozen Iowa college students. And I remember thinking, when is the photographer going to show up to document that he's doing this? And then someone explained, well, he just likes basketball. And so you would see, in Iowa, you have the chance to see these people before they become what they become. So I would go to these and, hoping to basically be excited about someone, and I was excited about no one. But I was kind of following Barack Obama, who was this, at the time, he was kind of seen as this, like, star at a moment where there were very few figures who anyone was excited about. And so when he came to Iowa, I started volunteering for his campaign. When I graduated, I got hired as an organizer. And so I basically organized for him in the area where I had grown up. And so when I went to do this project, I would sit down with people who had been organizers or been volunteers. And I kind of thought, well, I know what this story is. I'm basically just going to tape them telling my own story back to me in their own words. And what I quickly discovered as I started doing these interviews was how different my own experience was from most of the people who had the same job that I did on the campaign. Because most of the people in Iowa were people who were field organizers, were people who essentially moved to a place they had never been to do a job they did not come close to understanding, for a candidate they probably didn't know that much about, who was widely expected to lose. And they would be paid either zero or very little money. And so as I started to do these interviews, what became clear is this question of why people would do that was very personal to each of them. That there was something about Barack Obama that really spoke to them, but part of what that was related to was their own personal story. And so when I became a field organizer, one of the first questions I was asked was, why are you here? And forced to explain it. And the question wasn't, why do you support Barack Obama, or why do you want Barack Obama to be president? It was, what compels you to be a part of this? What compels you, given how unlikely he is to win, what compels you to spend your time trying to accomplish this? There were two reasons you were asked to do that. One was when you talk to a voter on the phone or talk to them at the doors, you basically have to pitch them on why you're doing this, why they should do it too, and it's to get them excited. But the other part of it is, inevitably in politics, if you're really excited about somebody, they are going to have days where they screw up. A bad poll is going to come out. The candidate is going to let you down. The campaign is going to let you down. You're going to let yourself down. And so on those days where it's really hard to do this stuff, you have to understand, this is why I'm here. And so hearing that from each of these people who had made the decision to go to this place, not really knowing what it was going to be, but just kind of wanting something to be different and deciding they had a role in making it happen, it was something that really struck me when I started sitting down with people.
So when I was going through the book, I was remembering, obviously, my own stories of meeting all of these different constituents, and a lot of them stick out, but namely, particularly because I did youth outreach for the most part. So you would meet people who had family members or friends who were in Iraq. And one of the most vivid ones was a Marine who was in a wheelchair, who had been volunteering for a couple of months, and he showed me a picture of a very different looking person, and he said, that was me 2 years ago. And I was in Iraq, and our convoy was attacked, and I'll be in a wheelchair the rest of my life, and I want to volunteer for Barack Obama because I don't want anybody else to go through what I went through. And I was really moved by that, and obviously that's a story that, like, I still get chills when I think about. What were some of those? I mean, you don't just have your stories, you have the stories of every person you had the opportunity to interview in the book. What are some of the ones that stuck out to you?
Well, Iraq was something that comes up a lot. I mean, one of my favorite characters in the book was an Iraq War veteran who became an organizer. He talked about that experience and how it had led him to want to get involved with a politician who had opposed the war to begin with. Another thing that one of the other stories that sticks with me is, to go back to that, it was very personal point. There was one organizer who told me about making the decision to move to Iowa. And he said, when I was 13, my grandfather took me to the Million Man March. And he said, the reason I'm taking you to this is I didn't march with Dr. King. I wish I had. And he talked about how he felt like hearing that at a young age, seeing this opportunity to go be a part of this, he didn't want to miss out on it. And the thought was, I don't know if he's going to win, but at least maybe when I was a 5-year-old kid, I didn't think a black person could be elected president. Maybe some 5-year-old kid in the future won't think that if I'm involved with this. And so he talks about how the night Obama won Iowa, he gets an email or a call that there's going to be a conference call with Senator Obama to basically say, way to go, we did it. And he sends the conference call number to his grandfather so he can dial in. And so that was one example, but there were also things where people would talk about their own personal life that were less related to Barack Obama. One person talked about how he was a freshman at Ohio State. He had signed up kind of on a whim to go to Camp Obama, which was this 2-day training in Chicago, where essentially you go and you're pitched on moving to Iowa or some other early state. And several people talked about sitting through that training and feeling like the person who led it had pulled them aside and said, you need to go to Iowa because we really need you there. And several dozen people described having this interaction with the same person. And I interviewed him for the book, and he said, oh yeah, I told everybody to go to Iowa. And a couple of them ended up working for him later in D.C. and described like having that moment of realization, like, oh, it wasn't just me. But one of them talked about how when he was a freshman at Ohio State, he signed up for this training, and he agreed to go out to Iowa, and he thought it would be a summer internship. And he talked about how he was 19. He hadn't done anything in politics before. He was attracted to Obama's kind of unity message. This idea of bridging divides, which he talked about a lot, which can sound kind of cliche now, but I think it's easy to forget just how divisive the Bush administration was when they were in office, and how that was, it seemed almost revolutionary to some people to hear a politician talking about that. And so he goes out to Iowa for the summer, and it comes to the end of the summer. He's supposed to go back to school. And he talks about going to the staff retreat, which was this 2-day retreat at a 4-H camp in rural Iowa, and being pulled. At one point, he kind of comes in contact with Paul Tooze, who was the Iowa State director, who, the way he describes it, offered or threatened, depending on how you look at it, to call his mom and encourage her to let him, to basically support him staying in Iowa longer. And he talks about how he made the decision to stay, and part of the reason he had gone to Iowa in the first place was he was in the closet, and he talked about how when you're growing up and in the environment he grew up in, he was told what you need to do in the future: you finish college, you marry a woman, you have kids with them, you get a job, you have that family. And he said there's always this nagging in the back of your head that future is not possible for you. And so what you try to do is find something to fill that void in your life, both to give it meaning that you can pour yourself into, but also to distract you from the fact that you're not being honest with yourself. And so he talks about how he went to Iowa partly for that reason. And the reason he stayed was because he felt like he was part of this thing that was so much bigger than him. And the connections he felt with people, he described it as feeling like it was the first time anyone had ever cared what he did all day. And I think that personal connection people would talk about was something that come up again and again when people talk about this campaign, the sense of community, the sense of family, whether it was staff with each other, whether it was volunteers with organizers, this sense that they were inspired by Barack Obama, but the reason they stayed, the reason they were so passionate about it, was partly because of the community they found when they went to do it. And so that was like a 10-minute answer, but that's
a fascinating one, though. Are those stories all in the book? Or
yeah, they are.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was also really fascinated by the different types of people that you interviewed. So you obviously people who were organizers making no money or very little money, and then also senior staff in a bunch of different states. By the way, I know the early states, Iowa in particular, but I'm curious what differences, if any, you saw between not just the senior staff versus junior staff, but among and between states as well that you picked up on over the course of writing this? Yeah,
well, so Iowa is about over half the book, and part of the reason for that is, David Plouffe talks about in the book how if he didn't win Iowa, he probably would have dropped out of the race the next day. So every decision they made over the course of 2007 was through the prism of how does this help us win Iowa? And if it doesn't, we don't do it. Because they were hoping for he was down in the national polls the entire year, and they were kind of hoping for this domino effect that would happen after winning Iowa. But some of the most fascinating people to interview were people working, especially in other early states, who the entire time they know, I'm organizing for this thing. And there's the possibility hanging over them the entire year that if he loses Iowa, then this entire year of work they put in is for nothing. Like, they wouldn't even get to have the election day because he would have dropped out before primary day. And so people talking about, talk about having to stay motivated that whole time. You just have no idea if this is going to matter or not. And I think another thing that stuck out to me is I interviewed several people who'd been in South Carolina. And in South Carolina, over half the primary electorate is African American. And something that everybody talked about in 2007 when he was losing in the polls was this concept of electability would come up all the time. Just, I don't know if he can win. I don't know if he can do it. I really have questions about whether or not he can win. And what people who were in South Carolina would talk about is there was another twist to that question was, I don't know if he can survive. And so people talking about how they had to figure out a way to answer that in these one-on-one conversations they would have to people. You can't really talking points your way through that.
You're talking about not survive politically, survive.
Survive, yeah. Period. And I think part of that was, people talked about having seen so many people, especially from the civil rights generation, be cut down while engaging in activism in some way. And so it was just a different experience depending on where you were. The other thing that stuck out was people who were in rural areas versus urban areas. If you're in an urban area, you've probably got half a dozen people who are your age. You know, you're staying in the office until midnight. Maybe you're going to the bar afterwards. It's like this really fun communal experience. You're 22. Maybe you slept with someone else in the office. I mean, it's like this gossipy thing. And some of the most fascinating interviews is, you know, you sometimes if you're not involved in politics, you think of it like the West Wing. Like, I'm going to go out, I'm going to be advising a candidate. I'm going to see the candidate all the time. And there were people who went to Iowa, and one woman talked to me about, you know, I thought I was going to be in Des Moines having this, like, great time with other people my age, working really hard, but, you know, having this shared experience. And then she gets told, we're going to need you to go to Charles City. And Charles City is this 8,000 person town. It's 45 minutes away from Mason City. That's like the landmark people use to describe it. Which if you're in Iowa makes a ton of sense. But if, say, you come from suburban Maryland and you're used to shopping at Whole Foods, that's going to be a very different experience. So the way this woman talked about going out to Charles City, you know, she drives out there. The town is very small. You can walk everywhere because it's just not very big. It's not because there are sidewalks everywhere, but because it's just geographically a small area. There's cornfields surrounding it. And she talked about how you get there and all you have is this list of voters. That's it. And so the way she described it, not as like the way I enjoyed the experience. It's like the way I survived the experience was I had to make relationships with people in the community. And so this 84-year-old man becomes her best friend, and he's a retired man in the town, and he would come by the office multiple times a week. He would write letters to the editor. He took her to church with him and his wife and introduced her to people at the church. She started to become friends with those people at the church. They introduced her to other people. And the common thread between those conversations, it's not like all these people she's meeting are Obama supporters. You know, they're just people who live in the town. And so the act of building relationships was just such a huge part of this experience for everyone. But the people in rural areas especially, I already had respect for, but I gained an absolutely newfound respect for, because they just talked about the loneliness of that experience at first and how they found ways to both make meaning out of it but also be successful. And I see a couple of them in the crowd, so I think that was another difference that really struck with me.
Did writing this book in any way change your view of the campaign? I know all of us have this, especially for Iowa, a very soft spot, and we reminisce, and if we have significant others or friends around us who did not share the experience, they roll their eyes immediately, and they're like, this is going to go on for 90 minutes. Yeah. Let's just get another beer, and they all meet each other, because that's how special it is to us, right? But I'm wondering, in hearing all of these stories, is your perspective of that changed at all, for the better, for worse, or in a more dynamic way?
Yeah, I think it was... Yeah, it changed on a couple levels. I mean, one, throughout the book, there's some first-person narration. And one of the mistakes I made in this project was no one interviewed me before I started. So I basically have no memories of this experience anymore. They've all been supplanted by other people's memories. Like, I don't trust anything that I remember. So when I went to write my own stuff, I had to, fortunately, I still have all my emails from 2007, 2008. And so I would try to, to kind of force myself to be real about this thing. I would go back through these emails, and there's really just no better way to make yourself cringe as a 34-year-old than reading ultra-passionate things you sent as a 22-year-old. I mean, I found this email I sent someone that I was kind of dating, just talking about I send this at 11 o'clock at night from the office. And there's a line in there about how this is worth losing relationships over. Not in response to any event that had come up with them. They weren't, just like 900 words along that theme. I had been on staff 6 weeks. I mean, that's how sucked in I was. And so I think to come at it again with a little bit of distance it's good that 12 years have passed, because I think this book in like 2014 would have been insufferable. But I think a couple things that changed are, one, I did not totally realize what people give up to do this stuff. So, I'm 22. This is my whole life. I mean, to me, I knew that guy at the time who talked about, I knew several people who had moved there from out of state for no money. And I basically thought at the time, well, yeah, of course. What else would you do right now? I was not a great organizer, but I was good at being enthusiastic, and that could kind of be infectious with volunteers. But I was also wildly unrealistic about the other things in people's life that would maybe prevent them from being able to volunteer. So, there was this woman who was a teacher at a middle school who was a precinct captain in my turf, and I was so grateful to her for doing that, because I couldn't find anybody in this area. And but she would say sometimes, I can't come in to volunteer. I have a 2-year-old and I have a 5-year-old, and I work full time, and my husband works 2 jobs, and I just don't think I have time to do this beyond the 1 or 2 hours a week I'm already giving you. And I just could not believe that. I mean, I was just like, what do you mean? And that would be kind of my initial response, but then I would channel that into more, positive, like, well, we'll do whatever, we'll set up some childcare in the office. We'll definitely make this happen. And, I would not be a jerk about it or anything. I had not lived enough of my life to understand what you give up to do something like this. And my respect for people who had done that really just went up a lot. I think at a macro level, a big thing that surprised me that I had kind of, not realized at the time was what a good validator Hillary Clinton was after she lost the primary. I mean, that primary went on 17 months, and it was brutal. And so when I went back and read all the coverage of it to write this thing, I mean, passions were so inflamed over the course of that thing. It was really striking to me how quickly she had turned from, meet me in Ohio, Barack Obama. And, I mean, there were comments like, at one point she had to apologize to an editorial board for kind of insinuating that Robert Kennedy didn't make it through the nominating process, which is partly why I'm hanging in. I mean, it is just crazy to read this stuff now, and it was from both candidates in different ways, but within 3 weeks of conceding her candidacy, she had endorsed Obama. And what was moving to me about that, as I, really kind of drilled down on it and interviewed people who had worked for her, who came to work for the Obama campaign, was it's easy when you're doing something like this to think, I am the only one who understands what this is like. Me and the people like me, there's something, unique about us that no one can understand unless you're doing it with us. And, the Clinton organizers did the exact same thing for 17 months. And then after she lost, so many of them came over to the Obama campaign. And the reason that was important was not just, for the expertise they brought to the campaign, which was good, but it was also really important because it signaled to all of her supporters that this is bigger than any one candidate. What we're trying to do, like, the purpose of this is not to elect one candidate. The purpose of this is to affect people's lives. And we are willing to let go of this and see the bigger picture. And I think just kind of watching how that played out, interviewing people who had actually made that transition, I had both not fully appreciated how hard that was, but also how well and gracious and important it was. And when I think about this primary right now, I think people sometimes get kind of caught up and they're worried about candidates attacking each other. I mean, I would be shocked if anything gets as heated as the 2008 campaign. And one of the things I kind of take some solace in is the ability of people to come together after that primary and see the greater mission.
That's a really good point, and I hadn't even considered half of that because you're in your own little. This was my experience in the primary bubble, and I hadn't considered the people who came on later to support. That's kind of amazing. Let's open it up for some questions. We have a microphone, so if you raise your hand, we'll call on you and get you a mic. And if not, I have way more questions for you because this is very fun. There's one up here.
Your introduction that I just read is wonderful. You say terrifying moments, joyous moments. Can you tell us the most terrifying moment you remember when you were on the trail of winning or losing?
That's a great question. So let me give you two examples. There's one that was terrifying at the time and one that is terrifying in hindsight. The day of the primary in Indiana, which was May 6th, maybe it was May 5th, I don't know. But there was this kind of do or die moment in the Indiana primary. Indiana and North Carolina were voting on the same day. It was after the Reverend Wright controversy was happening, and there was still a chance that Obama would not win the nomination, even though he had a lead in pledged delegates. So people who worked that primary had been on the campaign about 15 months by that point, if you had started at the beginning. And, we're a little burned out, and people talk about that in the book. But so everybody's kind of strung out, ready for this thing to be over. And on primary day, this email goes out to all the offices from the statewide leadership that says, everybody needs to get on a conference call right now. You dial into the conference call, and the leader of the state gets on and says, hey, everybody, could you mute your phones? Could you mute your phones? Shut up. And it's like noise in the background the entire time. Eventually, he just yells into the phone the news that someone has called the campaign and said there are bombs in 3 Obama offices. And he says, so I just called the Secret Service. Here's what everyone needs to do. Everyone needs to call the local police, get them to come down to your office, and they will clear the offices. So get everybody out of your offices, call the police. That's what we're going to do. And then he says, but after you clear the office, take all the call lists with you and the phones. Make sure you keep calling. And so that was probably that was the time, for me, where kind of the threat of violence was most direct. But so many people I interviewed in this book have some example of either the threat of violence to them personally or one of their volunteers throughout the thing. And then, in hindsight, the scariest thing, I now have a 2-year-old, and if my kid said this to me, I would just freak out. But something that happens on the campaign is you can convince yourself I'm working so hard. And, you just stay at the office until midnight and stare at your computer and think, I'm doing work right now, even though I'm not really doing anything. And I was guilty of that at times. And so towards the end of the campaign, there was this night where it was about 25 minutes from the apartment I shared with 3 other campaign staffers in the office I worked in. And I remember driving home at midnight, and it's the final weeks of the campaign. And at some point, I just wake up in the middle of the highway, and my car has come to a stop. It's kind of crossed the median of this isolated highway, and I'm just sitting there, and somehow no one is coming at me. It's so late at night that no one's out on the roads. And so there are examples in the book of people talking about getting into car accidents in the final weeks, or people talking about their personal health just utterly falling apart over the course of this thing. And it's so easy when you're in that environment to think, this is all that matters and I'll deal with it after. And so I think that's something in hindsight that is a moment of terror.
Any other questions? Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
So 12 years and 2 terms and this whole book and a couple of campaigns later, where are you at on how we pick a president?
It's a big question. Something that I think people forget how good, like, Barack Obama is basically an international celebrity in addition to an ex-president. Like, when he recommends books, it's national news. So I think it's easy to forget now just what a good politician he was. And not just he had an ability to give a great speech or, be strong in the moment when something would come up that he had to address quickly. His ability to inspire people to want to be part of something bigger than themselves was totally unique. And I think when I don't know if this is going to answer your question, but to this idea of how do we pick a president, I think sometimes when people talk about the Iowa caucuses, they stress correctly that the state is over 90% white and the caucuses are disenfranchising because you have to go there for 2 hours to participate. If you can't, physically make it to the space because you have to work or you have a disability, you essentially can't participate in the process, which is all true. The thing about the caucuses that, and this is one of the things that kind of kept me returning to this story, is they allow an ordinary person, if they are able to participate, to play an extraordinary role in how it turns out in their community. So the caucus is not an election. It's 1,781 simultaneous neighborhood meetings. And so there was one, just to give you an example of how one can make a difference, there were 17 precincts I was responsible for when I was an organizer in Iowa, which basically meant I was responsible for finding 857 supporters and having them be apportioned across these precincts in the right way. But one of the precincts I was responsible for was a one-delegate precinct, which basically means you have to win a majority of the people in the room. So 15 or 20 people will show up who live in this precinct. They'll all come together, and a majority of them have to stand with the candidate they're supporting in order for you to win that one delegate at stake. And I couldn't find anyone to be a precinct captain in this precinct. I was just beating my head against the wall, and someone suggested this guy Mel. And Mel was an African-American attorney in his late 30s who was originally from Arkansas, in a precinct that was almost everyone else was basically an older white person who worked in agriculture. And so I hear about this guy Mel. I sit down with him. I try to pitch him on Barack Obama. He's like, yeah, I'm still undecided. I kind of like Biden. Eventually, he goes to a Michelle Obama event and signs up as a supporter after that. But he still won't be a precinct captain. And we get close to the caucus. He won't volunteer. Eventually, I say to him, Mel, if you don't do this, nobody's going to do it. And we're going to lose this precinct. We're going to lose this delegate, which at the time felt like the world is going to end to me. Somebody in the book said to me, I was responsible for a state House District 68. When I went to bed, if I'd screwed up that day, I didn't feel like I was letting District 68 down. I felt like I was letting the entire world down. And so when he wouldn't do it, I just felt like this is awful. This is apocalyptic. And eventually I went to him and I said, Mel, if you don't do this, no one else is going to do it. And he talked about something kind of clicked in him. And I don't think it was just talking to me. He also talked to me about hearing from his aunt who lived in Arkansas about how it's all up on you there in Iowa. And she was an Obama supporter, and but she was like, if Iowa doesn't do this, this isn't going to happen. And something in him clicked, and he decided to become a precinct captain. And then he decided to start making phone calls, and he absolutely hated making phone calls. He would get hung up on, but he decided to keep doing it because he felt like, if I don't do this, no one else is going to do it. And then that night, on caucus night, the first call I got from a precinct captain saying what the result was in their area was from Mel, and he said, we won the delegate. And he walked into that room, he would tell me later, he and his wife were the only non-white people. And when they walked in, Obama did not have a majority. Edwards had some supporters, Clinton had some supporters, Richardson had some supporters, and maybe Chris Dodd had won. But he stood there in that room, and he had to essentially not debate, but converse with the other people who lived in his neighborhood and say, this is the direction I think the country should go, and even though there was, arguably on the surface pretty big differences between him and the other people in the precinct, he was able to convince the majority of the room to come over and stand with him and support Barack Obama. And part of that was the candidate, part of that was him. But when people talk about getting rid of the Iowa caucuses, what I worry about is losing the ability of an ordinary person to have an inordinate impact on the results. Whether it's in Iowa or whether it's somewhere else, I think that's worthy of debate. But without that, that winnowing effect that Iowa has just becomes done by donors or the media, and I feel like something would be lost. Again, a very long answer. I really got to shorten these answers. I'm sorry.
It's a good answer, though. I think we have time for a couple more. Did you have a... Yep. Oh, the back, and then we'll come up here.
Hello, Chris.
Ronnie Cho, everybody.
I want to say two things. One, really just a heartfelt thank you for doing this, for all of us who were there. Yeah, you can clap for that. We all talk about Iowa a lot, but as older we get, the memories fade of what happened. I think every 5 years, the margin in which we were down gets bigger. I think we're down 58 points now. No one thought we were going to win, and then it's going to be down 70 points, right? So, keeping us honest on what happened here. So, for posterity, for all of us, for our kids, for generations, thank you for capturing all of this for all of us who were there. And then, secondly, I guess the question I have for you, Chris, is, when people are reading the story for the first time and reading real people, I look through this, these are some of my oldest best friends to this day. What do you want people to take from hearing these personal stories of folks who were 22, 23 years old and had this crazy idea they were going to change the world? What do you want them to take away from that?
Well, that's kind of you to say. I think for those of you who don't know, Ronnie was an organizer in Des Moines. Through the caucuses, and then went on to work for the president in the White House. And I think to your question about what do I want people to take away from the book, I think it's two things. One is, I think so often when we hear about politics, it is that it is a mess, it is awful, it is just gross, and that's not wrong. But it can also be really affirming and hopeful. And there are many people in this country who want things to be different than they are right now. And this is a book about people who wanted something to be different and didn't just want something to be different, but decided to do something about it. And that's not enough in and of itself for something to change. But without that, nothing will change. And without that, as we've seen, things can get significantly worse. And so I guess the thing I hope people take away from the book is that they have a voice in this process, whether it's, it doesn't just mean presidential campaigns, the political process more broadly, the community they live in. You can legitimately play a role in shaping the trajectory of it. And these are people who did that at a time when the odds against it were pretty steep. So I hope people see some piece of themselves in the people in this book. And then I guess for me personally, the thing I hope people take away from it is how grateful I am to all of these people. So I guess those are the two things.
Awesome. Yep. Here, and then she had one as well.
How did you decide to go from internship to making this a career? Like, did you go into the internship thinking that you were going to make this a career?
Interning for the Obama campaign. So no. When I went into the internship, I thought Barack Obama will lose, and this will be I guess more accurately is when I got hired as an organizer in May 2007, I thought in 7 months Barack Obama will lose the Iowa caucus, and then what's great about this job is I'm not committing to anything long term. I don't want to be tied down too much. So I can throw myself into this. I mean, it was almost like, it was like this person is in town for 3 days, and I'm going to pursue a relationship with them with reckless abandonment. Because at the end of 3 days, it's over. And I don't have to worry about the long-term commitment implications or anything like that. It's just, I can just throw myself at this thing. And that's what I did. I mean, and for so many other people, I think, again, sometimes you think about politics, it's like, well, yeah, of course you knew Obama was going to win. No. I mean, he was supposed to lose. So all these people who signed up were doing it not thinking it was going to be a career necessarily. They just had a general sense that they wanted to make a difference, whatever that meant to them, and this was kind of the vehicle to do it. And so I just kind of threw myself into this thing, not really knowing that, 12 years later, weirdly, I'd still be talking about it. But what did feel like something I was committing to long term, because I had done some internships in college with people who'd run for office, or people who were, or there was one in government that I did, and I did have this sense that when I leave school, I want to do something connected to politics or public service or government in some way, and this was in line with that. And I think I thought, even if he loses, I had this plan where if he loses, what I'll do is work on some other campaigns, so when he runs again, I can get a better job. And that was basically the extent of it. So I think what was there long term was this sense that, this stuff matters, and I want to be a part of something that matters. But that was the extent of it.
Another question up here. Oh,
sorry. Did you have a follow-up? Sorry. Yeah, sure, let's do it. Come on.
What tips or suggestions would you give to somebody that wants to get involved now?
Yeah, I'll make this short. So I think, that idea just I think it's easy to game out who's going to win. The swing voters in Wisconsin, but we need turnout in Michigan. And you just don't. Just pick someone you like. Pick someone you feel passionate about. Pick someone or some cause or something where the answer to the question, why are you here, is pretty clear to you. And just, if you can afford it, throw yourself at it. And one of the big differences between then and now, I mean, a theme throughout the book is people who could afford to do this full time. And a lot of people can't. And so one of the things that I find really great about campaigns now is they are starting to unionize. And they are starting to create internships where you can get paid to be an intern there, as opposed to just expecting you to give 30 hours to this and thinking, yeah, of course. So what we've seen as a result of that is people who are who traditionally cannot afford to do this stuff are suddenly able to do it. And so I guess if someone is interested in getting involved, I would say find something you're excited about and just throw yourself at it and figure out how to make it work for you.
I love the title of your book because it really brought back to me how improbable it seemed that Barack Obama would get elected, that a black man would get elected at this day and age, that we've made it that far. And then a second term, it's like society has finally turned a corner. We're finally starting to get somewhere. But now we have Trump and everything all the baggage that's come with that. So my question is, from having, boots on the ground, do you have a sense for, are we taking a minor step back and we're going to start moving forward again? Are we going to be doing like a cha-cha-cha for a while? Or are we likely to see some more slippage because of the rhetoric that's coming out of the right now?
Sure, yeah.
Or I have a different question I could ask if you don't want to think futuristic.
What's that other one?
The other one is, what was your experience in that space at that time? Did you see that the right was going to be so visceral in this election and could have had some setbacks?
I'll start answering it based on some conversations you and I have had, and then I'll give you the second part of it. I think a lot of it depends on turnout and whether we actually show up. I mean, I think the current administration seems to be the logical extension of the Bush administration. they're all appointing the same people. It's the same policies. They're just being vocal about what those policies are instead of pretending that that's not what they're doing. So I guess, it depends on all of these candidates on the left and whether people donate and make phone calls and go knock on doors, and we'll see what happens. So I think that's the hopeful thing, as evidenced by all the stories from 2007 that you tell in the book.
And to your other question, do we have time for one question after this? Okay, great. My answer might be a bit of a downer. I think, as I said, I mean, my memories are mush of this period, so I don't really trust what I would have thought at the time. But I think when you go back and look at some of the coverage surrounding President Obama's inauguration, there was this sense of finality. I don't actually think this answer is a downer. Sorry, let me. So there was this sense of finality. John Lewis at one point said, who's, for those of you who don't know, his skull was cracked by a policeman marching for voting rights in Selma. And he's quoted that weekend of the inauguration as saying, "Barack is what comes at the end of that bridge." And I think that sense of, there were so many people who kind of projected the losses of 1968 onto Barack Obama's 08 campaign, like several people from an older generation. And it was kind of like this culmination feeling. And the epilogue... The epilogue has a title. The chapter's epilogue, the epilogue's title is "This Never Ends," and that comes from a quote from somebody I interviewed who talks about going to this inauguration celebration and having this sense that, this is the end. And then Barack Obama giving this speech at this thing called the staff ball, which was where all the staff, it was the only time all the staff who worked in different states, these thousands of people, were together in the same place. And it's inauguration weekend, and so many people don't really know what to do right now. And one person says, I remember thinking about that Bruce Springsteen song, Glory Days, where these guys just sit around talking about their high school baseball championship and wondering, is this going to be us? Because it had been a year since the Iowa caucuses. We're already talking about it quite a lot. And hearing Obama give this speech where he basically says, what made this campaign special was, all the things that were unique to that moment. But he ends it by saying, the main thing that made this campaign special was you. People who were willing to want to see something different, but also find other strangers who felt the same way and do something about it. And he has this line that I include in the book about clinging on to that essential part of yourself. And, because so much of what you read makes you feel like I can't do anything. So I think the finality that, I and some other people felt that that weekend he was inaugurated, I think was a bit misplaced. And the person who told me that story talked about how they realized in that moment that this never ends. We are not the end of this story. We are just people in this much larger story that will go on long after we are dead, of people who want to make the country they live in better. And that act of wanting something to be different, taking action to make it happen. He talks about how he didn't think of that again until the night Trump won, and was reminded, this never ends. We have to keep doing this. And so I think, while there may have been a sense of finality to the end of Obama's election, what I find so inspiring is, the way people who may have first been inspired by Barack Obama are still trying to do something different today. Ronnie managed Lauren Underwood's campaign in Illinois, one of the people who took back the House. It doesn't just have to be political, though. And so in the epilogue, I talk about some things people are doing now. And so that is, again, a very long answer to your question.
Sorry, we'll take the last question, and then, Chris, you're going to sign some books, right?
Yes, I will sign books here in the erotica section.
Hi there. Looking forward to reading your book. My name is Layla. I was actually at the White House Office of Presidential Correspondence, and then I was convinced to go down to Virginia and buy a car and just head out there because they need me. And now I'm here, so looking forward to this. My question is really tied to the first question that you had, but what is the future of grassroots campaigning? Clearly it's the most successful one during the first term and the second term, but what do you foresee for grassroots community engagement in the future?
Do you want to say anything there? Or?
Sure. I mean, I'm very hopeful when I see particularly younger candidates, and not necessarily even at the presidential level, but local races, city council races, state assembly. There are a lot of really inspiring young candidates and a lot of people who are working their hearts out for them, and I think that's an amazing thing. So I'm actually very hopeful. I feel like people are less complacent. We experienced this in 2007, right? Like every CNN and MSNBC would blast these headlines like, oh, young people are not going to turn out. Here's how low turnout was the last couple of cycles. Will they come out? And we're like, yeah, they're going to come out. Oh, the polling indicates they're not going to come out. Like, right, because they all have cell phones and you're calling landlines. Like, that's why your polling is wrong. So I think it's equally inspiring now, just in different ways, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think the spirit that kind of animated people in this book. I worked the 2017 Virginia elections a couple years ago, and it was the first significant election after Trump's inauguration. And what I saw there, which I think was just a preview of what happened in 2018, was all of these people who had never been involved before getting involved, running for office themselves, starting grassroots groups, starting indivisible chapters in their hometown. And the technology has advanced to the point, like I had a flip phone in 2008 that for half the campaign didn't send texts. And the technology has advanced to the point now where things are much more decentralized, but in many ways so much more effective. And the ability of someone now to find a way to get involved in their own community is the barriers to entry are so much lower than they were back then. And so, like Cal, I'm actually incredibly hopeful about that.
Well, thank you, everybody. Come join Chris over here. Thank you for writing this book. Again, it was very inspiring. So come get it signed. I want one as well.
Great. Thanks, Cal. Thanks, everybody.